What would you do if you saw a police officer attacking a fragile elderly man in broad daylight? The scene feels almost unreal. The uniform meant to protect instead turning into a weapon of cruelty. People around freeze, unsure whether to intervene, torn between fear of authority and the undeniable sight of injustice. The officer's hand strikes again, while the old man stumbles but refuses to bow. His silence speaks louder than screams, his dignity unbroken even as the blows fall. But here's the question: does power give anyone the right to humiliate the weak? The crowd whispers, cameras record, and tension rises. What no one expects is that this frail man, with tired eyes and slow steps, carries an identity so powerful that the entire city will soon be talking about what happened next. It was a quiet afternoon on a narrow street, where the air carried the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. A few neighbors sat on their porches, others passed by on foot, enjoying the calm of the day. Into this peaceful scene walked an elderly man, his steps slow and measured, his back slightly bent with the weight of age. His gray hair shone faintly under the sunlight, and his gentle expression gave him the look of someone who had lived through much yet carried no bitterness. He clutched a worn walking stick in one hand, moving carefully, pausing at times as if every step required thought. The stillness was broken when a police officer appeared, his presence sharp and heavy against the calm. His face was set in a hard frown, his posture stiff with authority. Every movement spoke of arrogance, as if the street itself belonged to him. He looked at the old man, not with care but with irritation, his temper quick to ignite. The wind picked up, carrying unease through the bystanders who sensed tension building. Eyes followed the officer's steps, hearts tightened as the fragile man and the power-drunk officer stood only a few feet apart, a storm waiting to break in the middle of an ordinary day. The officer approached with heavy steps, his voice sharp as he barked at the frail old man. He accused him of loitering, of being in a place where he did not belong, throwing words meant to cut deeper than any blade. The man, with his thin frame and silver gray hair, simply stood there, holding a small bag in his trembling hand. His eyes did not challenge, nor did they plead. They carried a quiet sadness, the kind that spoke of a life filled with battles no one else could see. The officer leaned closer, his tone dripping with arrogance, demanding answers the man never owed. People nearby slowed their steps, watching uneasily, whispering but doing nothing. To them it looked like another scene of authority crushing someone who could not fight back. The old man did not resist. He did not argue. He only lowered his gaze, his silence louder than words. Everyone thought it was just another case of abuse of authority, until the first slap landed. The officer's hand struck the man's face with force, sending a ripple of shock through the bystanders. Gasps filled the air. Some reached for their phones, others turned away in discomfort. But the old man remained still, his calmness unsettling, as if he carried a truth no one around him yet knew. The officer's voice rose louder, dripping with disdain as he loomed over the frail old man. His badge gleamed under the sunlight, a symbol of authority twisted into intimidation. The crowd that had begun to gather sensed something was about to happen, but no one dared to intervene. The officer shoved the elderly man in the chest, causing him to stumble back a step, his balance fragile yet his composure intact. The old man did not raise his voice, did not retaliate. He simply looked at the officer with eyes that carried decades of quiet strength and unspoken sorrow. The officer sneered, mocking him with insults about being useless, worthless, a burden on society. Each word struck harder than the shove, but the old man stood silently, his trembling hands gripping the handle of his cane. His silence only seemed to enrage the officer more, as though calmness was an act of defiance. The arrogance on the officer's face grew sharper with each insult, his chest puffed with the power of unchecked authority. Then it happened. The officer raised his hand and struck the old man across the face. A sharp crack echoed through the air, followed by a collective gasp from the bystanders. Mothers clutched their children closer, young men looked away in disbelief, and the air grew heavy with shock. The elderly man's head tilted slightly from the blow, his cheek reddening instantly. Yet even then he did not retaliate. He straightened slowly, meeting the officer's glare with a quiet dignity that unsettled everyone watching. The officer, however, mistook this silence for weakness. He shoved him again, harder this time, his voice thundering accusations about respect and obedience. The arrogance in his tone was laced with cruelty. as though he believed himself untouchable. The elderly man's cane slipped slightly from his grip, but he steadied himself with a resilience that surprised the crowd. He did not cry out, did not beg. His calmness only deepened the tension, for the people around began to sense that this was no ordinary man. And then came the moment that would change everything. The officer's hand lingered in the air after the strike, his chest heaving with self-satisfaction. Unaware of the storm he had just unleashed, the crowd fell into an uneasy silence, as if holding its breath. If only the officer had known whose face he had just struck. The crowd that had been frozen in shock moments earlier now stared in disbelief as the old man, instead of collapsing into weakness, slowly straightened his posture. His hands no longer trembled, his shoulders squared, and his chin lifted with a quiet authority that felt out of place for someone of his age. The arrogance in the officer's face faltered for a brief second, as if he could sense something was shifting, but could not yet grasp what it was. The old man's eyes, once filled with pain and humiliation, now locked directly onto the officer's with a sharpness that carried weight. It was not the glare of a victim, but the gaze of someone who had seen far worse than a corrupt man in a uniform. A subtle silence fell over the bystanders, broken only by the officer's nervous scoff as he tried to reassert his dominance. In the old man's steady stare, fragments of a deeper story began to surface. The faint scars across his knuckles, the way he carried himself even under assault, the discipline in his breathing, all of it hinted at a life forged in struggle and resilience. For a moment, it was as if the past itself began bleeding into the present. The officer leaned in, spitting insults, convinced he was in control. Yet with every word, the old man's quiet strength only grew more pronounced. The tension became unbearable, a thick air of suspense wrapping around the scene. People exchanged nervous glances, realizing this confrontation was no longer what it seemed. This was no ordinary old man. This was someone who had faced armies. The officer, still flushed with arrogance, lunged forward again, his hand outstretched to shove the old man down. But this time, something shifted. With a movement so fluid it was almost invisible, the old man redirected the officer's arm, sending him stumbling forward as if he had tripped over his own feet. Gasps erupted from the crowd, phones lifted higher, recording every second. The officer, humiliated, turned with rage and threw a punch, expecting to see fear. Instead, the old man sidestepped effortlessly, his hand brushing the strike away like it was nothing. The murmurs grew louder. People couldn't believe what they were witnessing. This frail elderly man who moments ago looked vulnerable, now moved with a quiet grace that spoke of years of discipline. Every strike the officer launched was calmly deflected, not with force, but with precision. The officer's aggression looked clumsy compared to the old man's measured responses. Sweat began to bead on the officer's forehead, his confidence slipping with each failed attempt. Then, in a voice that silenced the chaos around them, the old man finally spoke. His tone was calm, but carried an authority that pierced through the air. "You should stop now," he said firmly, his eyes fixed on the officer with an intensity that made even the bystanders shiver. The officer froze for a moment, startled not only by the man's words but by the weight behind them. It wasn't just confidence. It was the voice of someone who had seen and commanded far more than anyone there could imagine. The crowd exchanged glances, whispering to each other. Who was this man? How could he resist so easily? The officer, breathing heavily, hesitated, unsure of his next move. The once helpless old man now stood tall, untouchable, his calm presence overwhelming the officer's aggression. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone watching knew the confrontation was no longer one-sided. The mystery surrounding the man grew thicker, leaving the officer and the crowd desperate to understand who he truly was. The old man slowly reached up, his hands steady, and removed his sunglasses. The moment his eyes were visible, a ripple spread through the onlookers. A few gasps broke the tense silence. Then, with deliberate calm, he took off his hat. The officer's face, drained of color as recognition, hit him like a blow. The man standing before them wasn't just some frail stranger. He was Chuck Norris. The crowd erupted in whispers and stunned exclamations. Phones trembled in people's hands as they recorded every second, realizing they were witnessing something unforgettable. The officer staggered back, his arrogance collapsing under the weight of the truth. He had tried to humiliate someone, who carried decades of respect, strength, and discipline in every fiber of his being. This wasn't merely an old man on a quiet walk. This was a living legend who had once trained entire generations of fighters. The atmosphere shifted instantly. What had seemed like an uneven fight now became a revelation that left everyone breathless. The officer stood frozen, his arrogance shattered in front of everyone. Moments ago, he had tried to humiliate a man he thought was weak, but now he could barely meet his eyes. Chuck Norris didn't strike him back, didn't use the overwhelming force he easily could have. Instead, he showed restraint, the kind of discipline that only true strength can master. He looked at the officer calmly and said, "Power is not about crushing others. It's about protecting, respecting, and knowing when not to use it." The words echoed louder than any punch ever could. The crowd, still recording, nodded in agreement, their murmurs filled with respect. Even the officer's own pride seemed to collapse under the weight of that lesson. For the first time, the man in uniform appeared small, not because he lacked authority, but because he had lost his humanity. And in that moment, he realized that respect cannot be demanded through arrogance. It must be earned through character. Chuck Norris turned away without further humiliation, proving that true justice lies in self-control, not domination. His lesson became more powerful than any physical retaliation. Respect the elderly, understand the balance of power, and always choose humility over pride. But the real question remains, do you think the officer truly learned his lesson, or will arrogance always return?